Well, after his two-day trip to Egypt, John Kerry met with the foreign ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council. He has held talks with the region's leaders in Saudi Arabia, this before flying to the UAE and Qatar. Well, let's speak now live with journalist Neil Clark, a contributor to the British Guardian newspaper who's written extensively on the Middle East. Sir, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the program. Of course, some of the Gulf monarchies on Kerry's talks list have come under severe criticism for repression on their own turf. We're most notably talking about Bahrain, of course, Saudi Arabia. Given the U.S. commitment to supposedly spreading democracy around the globe, how does this alliance sit with that commitment?
Well, it doesn't sit at all, does it? I think it highlights a sort of glaring hypocrisy which underlines the whole of U.S. policy. And it's very interesting to compare the U.S. policy towards Syria with that of Saudi Arabia. Because last February, the Syrian government announced a new constitution, a new democratic constitution that was going to allow for a multi-party system, free elections, etc. And what was the US response? It was to denounce it as a sham. President Assad was playing games. It was dismissed entirely. And the Saudis haven't done anywhere near as much as that in terms of democratic reform. The sort of reforms in inverted commas that they've introduced have been very, very tame. And yet the US has praised Saudi Arabia. So I think it shows, if you compare Syria to Saudi Arabia, the glaring hypocrisy of the US.
Well, why such a difference in the approach, in your view? Why this so-called hypocrisy, as you refer to it?
Oil contracts, arms deals. The fact of the game, Lucy, is that the US, when it talks about spreading democracy, what it really wants to do, what it does is it uses human rights violations as a pretext for intervention and for trying to destabilize and topple regimes which aren't amenable enough to US interests. And we've seen classic examples of that down the ages. We saw that in 1999 in Kosovo, where we were told there was genocide taking place against the Kosovan Albanians by the Yugoslav authorities. That wasn't true, but that was the pretext for a bombardment of that country with the aim of bringing about regime change, which happened in 2000. So we see this human rights, democracy kind of banner, being hauled out by the Americans to kind of topple governments which aren't following the line, if you like, aren't towing the US line, whereas countries with actually far worse records often on democracy, on human rights, like Saudi Arabia, are given arms, are giving economic, there's economic relationships with the US, and so it's a completely different ballgame with them.
And Neil, you've mentioned the arms deals, the oil contracts. Of course, the U.S. Does have some of the largest arms exports to Saudi Arabia, for example. But when you mention these as interests, do you believe that it's just about these economic issues, or is there a wider, perhaps, geopolitical interest that the United States has in that region specifically?
Definitely. Well, these autocratic Gulf states are the way in which the US has for decades maintained its control of this very important region, having these kind of leaders there, the undemocratic leaders in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, etc. This is the way in which the US can maintain its control of this very strategically important region. And of course, now there's a big problem because these governments, these autocratic regimes in the Gulf are coming under increasing popular pressure. And we see now quite clearly the hypocrisy of the US, because these great promoters of democracy, when it comes to Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, are not siding with the protesters. They're not siding with the opposition like they are in Syria. On the contrary, they're sending more military hardware to these countries, and they are supporting clampdowns on the opposition. So, there's no way that the US, I'm afraid, will allow regime change, in inverted commas, in Bahrain, for instance.
And I'm curious, given the growing calls for democratic change in countries like Kuwait and Bahrain, for instance, do you envision a situation where the U.S. might shift its position, sort of the way it did in Egypt when it went from backing Hosni Mubarak to backing the calls for change and the revolution there?
No, I don't, Lucy. And the reason why, because Egypt was very different. I think that Egypt is very economically dependent on US aid and financial assistance, so that the US were confident if Mubarak goes, whoever would come into power would still be dependent on US money and the brown envelope scenario, if you like. Whereas in Bahrain, for instance, or Saudi Arabia, it's a very different ballgame. They've got vast oil reserves. So if the opposition were to take power, or new groups were to take power in those countries, then they would have their own natural resources. So they would be naturally more economically independent of the US, and the US wouldn't have a big hold on them. And the other factor, of course, is the opposition in Bahrain and these other Gulf states is a Shiite opposition, and these would be likely to be very friendly with Iran, which would be the ultimate nightmare for the US.
All right. Well, thank you so much weighing in on all those issues there regarding Secretary of State John Kerry's visit, journalist Neil Clark.
Thanks.